Okay. Well, we're at session 7 of the Historical Jesus, and today we are having a look at a very quick summary of the early ministry of Jesus from the Gospel of Mark, and making just one or two comments here and there, and then we're moving on to the very important subject of miracles. Just a reminder that we're following the book written by E.P. Sanders, one of the landmark works on the quest of the historical Jesus at the end of the 20th century. And so most of the ideas found in here is EPs, and here and there I will elaborate if they are my own, and specifically highlight if they are quotations from E.P. Sanders. All right, so a very quick summary then of Jesus' earliest ministry in Mark. Why Mark? Mark is our earliest source. Mark was also the source used by Matthew and Luke, which is important for us because it means that Matthew and Luke deemed Mark as a reliable source. Okay, to some degree, of course, because they changed quite a bit of it and added and left some stuff out as well. So after the call of the first disciples, which was the topic for our previous session, Jesus goes to Capernaum and he starts to teach in the synagogue. Now, Capernaum, as far as we understand, is kind of like where we estimate Jesus' base was. Fishing village around the Sea of Galilee. And there was a synagogue, one we spoke about a bit earlier, what it could have looked like and so on. So that seems to be the place where he starts his teaching ministry. Mark is not so explicit on exactly what Jesus taught during these sessions. For instance, if you don't know, Mark doesn't have the Beatitudes. Mark doesn't have big blocks of teaching like Matthew, for instance, would have. But we are told that people were astonished by what he said, whatever that then was. Then a man with an evil spirit calls him the Holy One of God, and this seems to be quite a turning point. Jesus, of course, rebukes the spirit, but this seems to be the reason why Jesus starts getting famous in the early days, is this exorcism. We're going to be dealing quite a bit with exorcism, the difference between exorcism and healings, etc. So in the house of Simon, later named Peter, his mother-in-law has a fever, and Jesus heals her of the fever. And then from there on, it seems like people started coming to Jesus for healings and exorcisms. Jesus then the next morning goes on to the other towns and he's preaching in their synagogues as well. And he casts out demons. As we'll see later on, exorcism seems to be a specialization of healing miracles. And it does seem fair to say that this was one of the trademarks of Jesus. Many of the other miracle workers of this time, for instance, did not exorcise demons. And this, as a specialization, it does seem like something Jesus was quite well known for. All right, from here on, Mark seems to note and denotes that Jesus is followed by a big crowd. So this is how the story unfolds in Mark. We have a leper that comes to be healed, and this even leads to greater crowds starting to come, so that Mark mentions he could no longer go into the towns openly, right? And so he went out into the countryside. So one side of Mark depicts Jesus of getting famous quickly, and so famous that he can't walk around in towns. Like it's huge. This thing is blowing up. And then there's another side of Mark which we'll speak about as well, which seems to be in tension with this kind of idea that Jesus got this famous this quickly. All right. Anyway. What happens with the healing of the leper is something we'll come back to a number of times, because in the healing of the leper, we have one of the, basically the answering of one of the very important questions about the historical Jesus is, and that was he in line with, was he approving of the sacrificial system of Judaism, the law, etc., etc., etc. This is a very, very important question. And it's one that's plagued me for a long time, and I think I've kind of found the answer to the question. But it seems like here in the healing of the leper, we do see the official stance of Jesus towards Judaism and the sacrificial system. The temple, the priesthood, the law, the feast, the synagogues, etc. The leper asks to be made clean, and Jesus touches him. He says, "Be clean," and charges him to tell no one. But what must he do? He has to go to the priest. He has to take an offering as specified in Leviticus. This would have been possibly 2 birds, one to be sacrificed, one to be set free, and then followed by other sacrifices. This case is the clearest instance in which Jesus is represented affirming the temple, the priests, and also the purity laws. We don't, as a Christian, we don't really like these portions because we have ways of getting around this. This is still the old covenant, etc., etc. But it does seem that, at least at this point, Jesus affirms the Judaism of his day in terms of temple, priests, and sacrifices. All right. Jesus here is in agreement with the sacrificial system of Judaism. This becomes a very, very important talking point for the historical Jesus, and we'll obviously circle back to this. So Mark gives then, after these couple of healings, miracles, the affirmation of Judaism and its sacrificial system, Jesus' quick rise to fame and the crowds and etc., etc. Mark then runs into conflict. Gives us a run of conflict stories, 3 or 5 of these stories. And you will notice this of Mark, the stories are short, they are concise, and they are weaved together in then immediately. So it seems like Mark kind of exaggerates the process and shortens it and heightens it to some degree. But let's talk about the conflict stories. Right, I don't have the actual scriptures here, but if it's the first couple of chapters of Mark, it's like in the first 3 chapters of Mark. There's a paralytic. He's healed in a house in Capernaum, and then Jesus says to him, "What's easier to say, to forgive his sins or to heal him? I say, I forgive you, my son, your sins are forgiven." And this, then the scribes that are present at this time, they don't feel like this is great. How can he forgive people's sins? On what authority does he do this? This happens only in the temple when you bring your sacrifice. How can he, outside the temple, make these types of declarations? Then we have Jesus eating with tax collectors. And he was criticized by the religious because of that. And then Jesus' disciples did not fast, like, for instance, the disciples of John the Baptist or the Pharisees. He was criticized for this. So this creates a conflict. Mark is painting a picture of a rising conflict now. After all this great fame and miracle healings and whatnot and great teachings, there is now this rapid conflict that's building between Jesus and the religious system. Of course, then Jesus' disciples, they pluck they pluck the ears of grain on the Sabbath, and Pharisees appear out of nowhere, like they're just there. And they are in conflict with Jesus on why can his disciples do these type of things? Isn't this a violation of the Sabbath? And then lastly, in the run of conflict stories, we have him healing a man with a withered hand also on the Sabbath. And this leads to the Pharisees and the Herodians to plot to kill him. Right, so this is a rapid sequence. It seems to, according to Mark, take place over just a few days. But we do suspect that the author here compresses the events for dramatic effects. Stories are really short. Jesus says or does something, and there's an immediate reaction from everyone. In Mark 2, verse 1 to 36, the scribes and the Pharisees seem to materialize kind of out of nowhere for each of these situations to confront Jesus. The opening sections of Mark are dramatized and seems to be summarized. When Mark wrote the gospel, it's possible that he had a lot of pericopes. If you recall, pericopes are these short stories with a small introduction, context, healing, and then something being said, maybe a criticism, and then it ends off. These small little stories. It's possible that Mark had a bunch of these, and that he actually put them together in a narrative type of form. And that's why we have such a stark jumping from scene to scene, which doesn't seem to follow nicely in the normal narrative way. The starkness seems to come from the fact or the possibility that he had a bunch of pericopes that he was weaving together. Of course, the Gospels are not biographies in the modern sense of the word at all. So historically, and this is an important point, which EP doesn't expand too much on this, but I've read other books on the historical Jesus that do expand on this quite a bit, and so I have to agree with him here that it's historically not likely that these minor conflicts we've just mentioned actually leads to the plot of Jesus' death. It's just, if I can just deviate from the book here for a moment, it's just that these type of conflicts were par for the course in Judaistic religion at that time. Pharisees did not agree with the scribes always. The Essenes did not agree with the Pharisees or the Sadducees. The Sadducees did not agree with the Pharisees. They all had their own interpretation of things, and they were constantly in contact and in discussion. Possibly in the synagogues is where some of this might have taken place. So what scholars say is that historically this type of movement, this type of conflict is definitely not the type of conflict that would lead to someone's death. And so historically it's unlikely that these minor conflicts actually led to the plot of Jesus' death. And editorially, it's much more likely that Mark created the plot as it now stands in Mark 3 verse 6, only to later then, historically, editorially, it is not likely that Mark created the plot where it now stands here where we are in Mark 3 6, only to later introduce then in Mark 12 again a weaker form of opposition. It seems like something's out of sync in there. The most likely explanation for this is that possibly these first stories or conflict stories were possibly already grouped together by the time that Mark got his hands on them, and that he kept them together in a type of a proto Mark, if you like, that he used to build the narrative around. But for now, it's important that we see that in reading the first chapters of Mark, we are not reading a first-hand diary of the life of Jesus in Galilee, but it's an edited collection of individual texts that may originally have had different contexts, and is pulled from those contexts to create a new narrative for Mark. Now we are ready to take on the most substantive aspects of Jesus' ministry, which is the miracles, and then the message of the kingdom. So we're going to start with the miracles, and we're going to take a bit of a zoom out on the first century miracles, exorcisms, nature miracles. And we want to talk about what was the context for these. Did these things happen? Was Jesus the first to do these type of miracles? Was he the only one doing exorcisms? In other words, we do this to try and get into the mind of a first century Jew watching Jesus do a miracle. What would that have meant to that person? And what was the significance of these miracles? Often today, Christians or just people would point out that Jesus was the Son of God because he did these miracles. And this unfortunately cannot hold up under historical scrutiny because there were many people who did these type of miracles. So let's just get into it from a historical point of view. Mark places a lot of early emphasis on miracles. Although he mentions that Jesus taught as one having authority, he doesn't tell us much about what Jesus actually taught. Now, in the modern world, Jesus' miracles, of course, plays a substantial role in the evaluation of Christianity. Some view miracles as obviously fictional, and therefore conclude that Christianity must be a fraud, while others, on the other extreme, find in these miracles the proof that Jesus was not merely human, but that he was actually the incarnate Son of God. But both of these views are extreme views, and misses the ancient perspective. And that's kind of where we want to land here, which saw miracles as significant, absolutely, but not significant enough that the miracle worker would be understood to be anything other than fully human. Let's explain. Jesus was by no means the only one to whom miracles were attributed, and all miracle workers were not automatically Messiah. The Jewish literature does not depict the coming of the Messiah as a miracle worker, and this is quite interesting. There wouldn't have been the expectation then. But the combination Messiah, Son of God, and the ability to perform miracles is more of a Christian later notion. Jesus' miracles are to be studied in the light of other miracles of his own day, not in the context of subsequent Christian doctrine, that he was both human and divine. That's working from the back. I was about to say a very bad idiom. It's working backwards. and then deciding, okay, will we accept his message? Yes, we will accept his message because he was a miracle worker. It's kind of approaching this from the wrong angle. These miracles did not prove to his contemporaries that he was superhuman. Let's try and explain some of this. Let's look at magic and miracles in the ancient world. In the ancient world, physicians, doctors, their reputation was not that great, right? Scientific development in those areas were not very far advanced, and so their hit rate was very low. And so a lot of people resorted to other ways to try and cure their illnesses, sicknesses, or exorcisms, or their demon possession. There were mainly three sources, and this is EP's kind of a summary. He categorizes healing in the ancient world in three specific categories. The first one is healing by prayer, the second one is healing by miracle workers, and the last one is healing by magic, magicians. All right, let's have a look at each one of these in historical context. First one, prayer. Now, prayer is simply when someone asks God directly for healing. It would be surprising to learn that in the case of illness, the sufferer nor the family or friends prayed for healing. Why? Because healing is just, you don't need, prayer is just great because you don't need anybody else. And it's cheap, right? You don't have to buy anything, you have to offer anything. It's just a form of communication. It's inexpensive. And of course, people who were prayed for sometimes recovered. Some illnesses then therefore were understood to be cured. And if people always prayed for cures when sick, then their prayers would sometimes be answered. People would recover. Like if you have a fever, someone prays and you pray for fever, and the next day the fever is gone. The day after that, you're with your friends and you tell them, hey, I had a fever and I prayed and it worked. I'm better now. So in this way, of course, it might just be that your fever was at its end, which, we recover from fevers without anything. But that would stoke the next cycle of people saying, but it worked for Kursi and Yanni, so I'm going to do the same. And so prayer was obviously kind of maybe the first port of call for healing and so on. But so you can easily understand how prayer becomes the main way to find healing. Of course, for certain things, like the growing of legs and arms and things, it's just a bit more tricky, I would say. But now, in the ancient context, the Greek god Asclepius, right? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He specialized in healing. He had shrines throughout the Mediterranean world that was specifically for this purpose. And dozens of brief accounts of healings have survived, of people who write that the god Asclepius had cured them. Some of the accounts can be explained, and it's quite believable. We could possibly explain it through psychosomatic occurrences or healings. Other reports of healings are completely incredible by modern standards, right? For instance, a man lost his eyes. He dreamt that someone poured oil in his eye sockets, and when he woke up, he had eyeballs and he could see. So he basically got eyeballs. The priest who wrote this account down don't really distinguish between what is credible and what is incredible. They just recording. If Asclepius could perform the one, he could obviously perform the other. And they did not consider it impossible because they understood, or they believed, that spiritual forces could influence the physical world in a very tangible way. And therefore, they did not, these stories developed amongst real sincere people. This was not necessarily a defrauding practice or a practice of insincerity. It was people who were completely sincere about what they experienced. Eb continues to say that he believes very few based their desire to deceive. That very few of these stories were based on the desire to deceive, but mostly, in many cases, wishful thinking and possibly exaggeration. Now, the point is, miraculous stories were common in the ancient world. Because of the ancient unscientific approach to these, and we would hesitate to assign deliberate falsehood or absolute truth as the cause of these stories. Needless to say, first century Jews also, just like their Greek counterparts, from time to time prayed to God for healing. The second method of searching for healing would be miracle workers. Okay, so what do we understand under miracle workers? In other words, they were people who performed miracles that were not gods or a god themselves. From the Greek world, there's a substantial account of Apollonius of Tyana, a traveling philosopher, a cult reformer, and a healer. He was known to have the power to heal and to exorcise demons. Jews were especially well known as miracle workers. Josephus claimed that they inherited the wisdom of Solomon and knew how to perform miracles and exorcisms. Illness and irrational behavior was often attributed to demon possession. So at this time, it seems like even sicknesses could be understood to be demon possession, like there's a demon that's actually taking control of the body and it's causing the sickness. Possibly that's why in some of our gospel accounts we have dumb and deaf spirit, because they literally believed there was a spirit that was making someone dumb and deaf. All right. So illness and irrational behavior was often attributed to demon possession, and exorcists were in much demand and cures were performed. Often just through power of belief in mind over matter. But Jesus himself granted that others in his day could perform miracles like his own. And so this is something we just find in the Gospels. Don't want to go into too much of it right now. Are there cases in the Gospel where people are doing these type of things? Some of them in Jesus' name. Others could do them, right? People who weren't God or weren't the Son of God could do them by using his name. All right. So, Hanani ben Doza lived in Galilee about one generation after Jesus. The most famous cure attributed to him closely parallels Jesus' healing of the centurion's servant in Matthew 8:15-13. But before Jesus, Honi the circle drawer, weird, strange name that I'll explain in a moment, 1st century BC. He was especially successful at praying for rain. Now, he would draw a circle, he'd go stand in it, and he would say, "O Lord of the world," I'm quoting, "I will not stir hence until you have pity on your children." And then it would begin to sprinkle. But he wasn't satisfied. Quote, "Not for such rain I prayed, but for rain of goodwill, blessing, and graciousness." Then it began to rain steadily. Now, the Pharisees of his day were in two minds about Honi, and his intimacy with God got him off the hook from accusations of blasphemy. Quoting, "Were you not Honi, I would have pronounced a ban against you. But what shall I do to you? You importune God, and he performs your will, like a son who importunes his father, and he performs his will." So the point is that there were Jews that were doing miracles in around the 1st century BC, 1st century AD. The Pharisees struggled with these Jews because though they didn't like them, they couldn't deny what was happening. They would stand in a circle and eventually it would rain. Now, you could put that down to coincidence if you like. It does rain a lot now and again. But they had reputation, and this was the culture. This was what was happening at that time already. Before and after Jesus. So Josephus also writes about Honi, he calls him Onias in Greek, but as a well-known man who prayed for rain, answered by God, and who was finally stoned to death. So unfortunately, many of these guys eventually meets I don't know if you can call them martyr's death, but they got stoned to death. You know, stoned to death is the Jewish way of saying we don't like you, you disobeying the law. They met this fate, even though they were people who could bring rain. I mean, can you imagine stoning to death someone who could bring rain? Like, there must have been some hesitancy on whether this was actually happening or not. But anyway, that's what's reported. So not long after Jesus' death, the early 40s, which is about 10 years after Jesus' life, there was someone called Thaddeus. He gathered a bunch of followers in the desert, and he promised them that they're going to march down to Jordan, and that the rivers of Jordan were going to part kind of like a second Moses. And even later, there was a prophet from Egypt, known as the Egyptian, who promised his followers that they would walk around the walls of Jerusalem and they would cave in like a Jericho's walls, right? Like a second Joshua. Romans were quick to stop the marching crowd in this case. in both cases, sorry, in which Thaddeus and several of his followers were killed by the Romans, while the Egyptian, he managed to escape. Okay, point being, just a bit of history, but point being, some of these miracles were nature miracles and not just healings. Seeing that they had followers, it seems likely considered that their promises were in some form credible, like in the fact that people would walk with them down to the Jordan to go and part it. It means like these guys were, had a reputation as miracle workers. The point of all of this is to show that someone walking around in Galilee performing a miracle here and there means not that that person is necessarily God, the Son of God, the Messiah, or anything like that. It's someone who has a close relationship with God and knows how to make God do stuff. So the Jewish assumption in these cases was obviously not that was obviously that the miracle worker could influence God, and God, of course, could do whatever He wished. Okay, so that's the category of miracle worker. You have prayer, and then you could consult a miracle worker, someone who has a relationship with God and can make God do certain things for them. Right. Lastly, is an interesting category, the category of magicians. Now, this seems to be individuals that had a gift and a talent to get the spiritual world to do stuff. Magicians did not perform miracles because of a special relationship with the one true God, for instance, but they used tested techniques and follows certain rules that might have been handed down to them of their craft. Magic was based on the particular application of a widespread view. And here I'm going to quote EP here. I'm going to read this portion. This is the assumption of magic. There's a great chain of being, which everything is linked to something else, both above and below. This manipulation of certain elements would then influence the beings up the chain to the deity. The correct manipulation of lower elements, cat hairs, toenails, together with the right words, incantations, right, and names, would make a higher deity perform one's desires, right? So this is the premise on which magic took place. Magicians also were for hire, great business. Some of the magic used to cause negative effects, and that would be considered as black magic. The magic that could perform a healing was, of course, good and was considered to be white magic. Still magic, right? White and black. Josephus, when he praises Solomon, explains that the Israelite king left behind incantations and techniques. Now, this will fall under magic, right? Incantations and techniques of exorcism that some Jews still use. In other words, in Josephus, if you don't know, he is really the only historian of the first century, as far as I know, and Jewish at least. And he is of the opinion that Jews had techniques, incantations, methods to bring healings, and they got these from Solomon. Now, Solomon's an interesting pagan character from the Old Testament. But anyway, we leave that at that. According to Josephus, for instance, Eleazar performed such exorcism before Vespasian and his sons, Vespasian being the Roman emperor. Quoting from Josephus, he put to the nose of the oppressed man a ring which had under its seal one of the roots prescribed by Solomon. And then, as the man smelled it, he drew out the demon through his nostrils. Then, wishing to convince the bystanders and prove to them that he had this power, Eleazar placed a cup or fruit basin full of water a little way off, and commanded the demon, as it went out of the man, to overturn it and make it known to the spectators that he had left the man. Of course, the demon duly performed. What is the point of this? Is to show that there was a culture in the time of Jesus of exorcisms by magic and healings by appeal to God. It was part of the culture. And none of these people were understood to be Messiah, Son of God, or superhuman in any way. They were literally just people who had either got the tricks or they had the relationship, right? Now, Apollonius simply commanded the spirits. I forgot the right guy's name here. Apollonius, my apologies. Apollonius simply commanded the spirits to depart, and he was autonomous and he made up his own rules, exerting his spiritual charismatic power, while Eleazar learned which routes should be used in exorcism, and that's kind of the difference between magic and miracle worker. All right. From this we see that most ancient people did not have the hard division between natural and spiritual that we have today, and it's quite an interesting topic. Supernatural was not a word back then. The cosmos was populated by good and evil spirits who could be controlled by certain people to enter the world of sense and perception. There was a common belief in powers in the heavens and that certain names had power. John relates to Jesus that some are casting out demons in his name. And then Jesus in Mark 9 says, don't, leave them, don't forbid them. In Matthew 12, 27 to 29, Jesus grants that their sons can cast out demons. The question was, by what power and in whose name? So here is the crux of the exorcism, at least. The question for an ancient Jew was not, could demons be exorcised by a human? That's not the question. The question was, what power was behind the exorcism? If you recall, the Pharisees also they accused Jesus of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub. So this is a very important point, that it's not the fact that people could cast out demons or exorcise demons that was surprising to anyone. The question was always, by what power are you? Is this black or white magic? Who's behind this power? That's the real question. So in studying Jesus' miracles, this is an important point, we're not going to raise the question of whether or not the reported incident could really have happened. That's not what we're going to do here. We will assume the viewpoint of the contemporaries. They believed in the possibility of miracles, and so for now we're going to do the same. According to the Gospels, Jesus performed two types of miracles. Healing miracles, which includes a subcategory of exorcism, and then secondly, the nature miracles. Let's run through some of the miracles, the healing miracles that's found in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and have a look at what EP comments on these. Right, in Mark, let's start with Mark. In Mark, in the healing miracles, the emphasis is often placed on faith. And it seems to be, in that sense, anti-magic. Now, there's no real technique for most of these miracles. It's does the person believe in Jesus' relationship with God type of situation. So that's miracle worker classification. For example, his robe did not possess magical power as such, but it was the result of the woman's faith that healed her. But there are two incidences in Mark that have pricked the imagination of scholars for a very, very long time. These are healing miracles in which Jesus does physical actions and an incantation or a saying when he does the miracle in addressing and touching the person. The first one's in Mark 7, where Jesus puts his fingers into the ears, spat and touches the tongue, then looked up to heaven and said, Patha. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it, the Aramaic word which means be open. Now, if you grow up in a Pentecostal church like me, you've seen people do this all the actual time. Like, people do this all the time, like they touching and, like it's going to make a big difference. But this is something which is interesting about Jesus' miracles, is there's two of them where there is an incantation, like a saying that needs to be said, and his hands doing things, spitting, touching, which leans towards the magic category, at least for an ancient observer. I hope I'm explaining this properly. In Bethsaida also, Jesus takes a blind man outside the village. He spat on his eyes and he laid his eyes on him. So it wasn't just be healed, it was like a small little ritual. The man's sight is partially restored. Jesus obviously puts his hands over the man's eyes and the sight then was fully restored. This is very interesting on two accounts. Of course, we consider Mark to be like You know, he's like, Mark's the star of the gospel show because of his earliness and the fact that everybody else is happy to use him as a source. But it's so interesting that in Mark we do have these two accounts where the healing leans towards the magic spectrum, and you have this half miracle happening. What the heck is going on here with a half miracle? How does Jesus perform a half miracle? And why would he include a half miracle like this? Jesus fails at the miracle, half, and then he has to do it again. Like, yeah, it doesn't sit really well. And believe it to be true, and let me just throw this out here, spoiler alert, Matthew and Luke, guess what they do with these two miracles? No more. They're not in Matthew and they're not in Luke. Matthew and Luke read Mark and they're going, not the heck, we're not adding this in there. This is against what we believe Jesus to be. Like this we don't like this, right? So here in Mark we have techniques that call to mind a more magical spectrum of healing. The incantation, be opened up, Ephphatha. It sounds like an incantation. It is noteworthy here to note that both Matthew and Luke, they drop these stories from their narrative accounts, although they contain most of Mark's miracle stories. Why in the world would they do that? It might be that later authors saw Mark's accounts were tending towards magic, and so they also omitted them. In Mark, there are almost two contradictory themes with respect to the impact of Jesus' healings. And we're going to be talking about this tension quite a lot as we move forward. So I'm just going to lay it on the table. Maybe you've never thought of this before, but it seems to be quite something that, especially in Mark, is prevalent and has puzzled scholars for a very long time. But here's the thing. The impact of the healings. What was the impact on the healings on the people, the fishermen, the people who worked with their hands in the fields around the small villages of Capernaum, etc., etc. There's a lot to be said here, and I can't do all of it, but I'm just going to stick to my notes right now. The first effect, as we see in Mark, is that they drew crowds and was the reason why Jesus became famous, right? In Mark, Jesus doesn't become famous because of his teaching as such. It's the miracles, the exorcisms that start drawing serious crowds and creates his fame. Let me quote 4 little portions from Mark to just highlight Mark making this apparent. Fame spread everywhere throughout all the region of Galilee, Mark 1:28. Later, the whole city gathered, and Jesus healed many, Mark 1:33-34. He could no longer openly enter a town, but was in the country, and people came to him from every quarter, Mark 1:45. This pattern continues until Jesus draw crowds from Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, even from Tyre and Sidon. So there's a side to Mark which says that these miracles, man, it went viral, right? It exploded. Jesus couldn't even enter towns anymore. So this is great. I mean, and that's the kind, I guess that's the picture we want to believe, that's how it happened. Like just 1 miracle, 2, 3, and there's just uncontrollable crowds everywhere. But there's a counter to this in Mark as well, which places it in tension. Mark insists that Jesus did not try to attract attention by the miracles, by often telling people who were cured or were freed from demon oppression not to tell anyone, right? This is rather strange. Yet they seem to have done it anyway. This seems to be Mark's way of saying that Jesus preferred not to seek fame. So this is what EP's conclusion is. The reason why Mark, the conclusion from Mark putting this in there and seeing and writing about this in this way is to try and indicate to the reader that Jesus, although he became famous because of the miracles, he didn't want to be famous. He didn't seek fame, and he didn't do his miracles to produce fame or to get more followers. And of course, this stands in very strong tension with the signs of the Gospel of John. All right. So let's move on. In Matthew, the miracles are dimmed in the light of the teaching. So what we see in Matthew happening is, of course, Matthew uses Mark. Mark doesn't have a lot of teachings of Jesus. Matthew has some other source. Some call this the theoretical source Q, which has the sayings, the blocks of sayings, like literally all that red stuff you see in Matthew, the Beatitudes, for instance. Big blocks of teaching that Matthew has that Mark doesn't have. And then much of it we found in Luke as well. And then in Matthew, the miracles dim a little bit in light of the teaching. It's like the teaching steps forward and takes center stage. The first 3 chapters, unlike Mark, contain ethical teaching. Sermon on the Mount. Miracles come later, which is interesting, the difference. Why did Matthew do this? Why does he put the teachings before the miracles? Once the miracles come, they come in a set of 10, which most scholars believe, and this is in chapter 8 and 9, is a nod to the 10 commandments. We have possibly mentioned already that Matthew models Jesus in some way on Moses, Sermon on the Mount, the birth narrative into Egypt, coming out of Egypt, coming through the waters, 40 days in the wilderness, all the way to the mountain where he gives his sermon, and then 10 miracles, which is interesting. But it is more interesting in contrast to Mark, that Mark does not have a Sermon on the Mount, and Mark's miracles happen early. It's different, right? So in Matthew, the emphasis shifts to first all the great teachings and then the miracles. Matthew often indicates to the reader that Jesus has fulfilled prophecy. Of course, Matthew is very well known for this. He prefaces words by saying, accounts and little stories or happenings, sorry, I can't find the right word there, by the following words. This was to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet. Matthew does this a lot more than anybody else. With regards to Jesus' healing, Matthew, of course, quotes Isaiah 53 verse 4, which is that very famous, he took our infirmities and bore our diseases. Matthew understands this to mean that he is actually healing people from diseases. Of course, later on, Christians took this and we said, no, this is about the cross. This means he takes on our sin. All right. So Matthew often omits and shortens the miracle stories of Mark. And this is one of the interesting things, growing up and believing that Mark was a summary of Matthew. There's actually a lot of contrary evidence between Mark and Matthew that moves the other way. Now we know Mark is not a summary, but one of the reasons why Mark can't be a summary, or isn't a summary, is that Matthew shortens Mark in many, many situations. Especially in some of the healings, Mark, some of the details are omitted by Matthew. But Matthew does have some healing accounts that's not found in Mark. For instance, the healing of the Gentile centurion's servant, which is the healing of a Gentile. And possibly a reason for Matthew including this is that, of course, they had to consider and incorporate the coming of the Gentiles. The later we move in Christianity, the more Gentiles come in. And so it stands to reason that in the early Mark didn't know about this miracle, and that Matthew kind of did know about this and includes it because it was important to Matthew, that Gentiles also must be touched by this miracle working power. Of course, Matthew adds then, not even in Israel have I found such faith, which is a clear indication that Gentiles are starting to believe and that they have great faith. Of course, just to can I deviate a little bit? How much time have I got left? Oh, I can. Just quickly, the two most troubling concepts for later gospel writers were, number one, the fact of the delay of the end, as promised by Mark, but also the inclusion of the Gentiles, the fact that the church became more and more Gentiles. And so these two things seem to be central in some way in the way in which the gospel writers structure their gospels. They have to include, they have to talk about, they have to explain why the end didn't come, like Mark promises in the lifetime of Jesus. And secondly, they have to explain why Jews didn't like the message, didn't like Jesus very much, but Gentiles did. And so that could possibly be one of the reasons why Matthew would include this in his healing accounts. All right, let's move across to Luke. Now, in Luke, the principal contribution to healing miracles was a multiplication of Mark's miracles. In Luke, there are an added 2 instances of healing on the Sabbath, and another instance of healing of lepers, and a second instance of the resuscitation of a person. One of these sees a resuscitation of a mother's only son, which is reminiscent of what Elijah did, the miracle he did. And when he does this, Jesus, then people say a great prophet has arisen amongst us. Interestingly, this is not found in Mark. I don't think it's found in Matthew. But the point here is also that one of the major themes of Luke is that he sees Jesus as a great prophet, right? And the prophetic aspect of Jesus is highlighted in the Gospel of Luke. I don't have time to go into this, but this is a central theme for Luke. And so interestingly enough, he includes miracles that accentuates that theme. All right. Jesus as a prophet is a major theme in Luke, from the birth narrative all the way through, right? From a Gentile perspective in some ways. So a quick side note on Luke. In Luke, the social status of people are incredibly important. For instance, when Zacchaeus repents as a very rich tax collector, he redistributes, and he repents by distributing back to those he stole from. In Luke, we don't have blessed are the poor in spirit as we find in Matthew, but literally, blessed are the poor. And added by Luke, not found in Mark or Matthew, is, and woe to the rich. It seems like Luke was it was very important to him to show that Jesus was on the side of the poor. Right. We have the raising of the widow's son, right? The poor widow. We have a woman featuring in Luke. I missed out the whole line here. We have a lot of stories cautioning against riches in Luke, which we don't find in the others. The rich fool, the rich man and Lazarus, the widow's mite, the widow's justice, and the raising of the widow's son. Also, of course, women feature very much in Luke, way more than any other gospel. And so we also have a healing of the woman with the bent back. Now, the point of all of this, I guess, EP doesn't say this, but now reading this in retrospect, it does seem like the healings play into the theme of the writer. So in Matthew, healings are added to show that Jesus fulfills prophecy. In Luke, healings are added to show that Jesus is on the side of the poor and in some ways against the rich. So that's something that's quite obvious to pick up throughout this. Okay, now Matthew seems to have collected his material in blocks of teaching and healing. So what we have Mark, which is a very compact narrative with hardly any teaching compared to the other Gospels. When we get to Matthew inserts these large blocks of teaching that scholars say he got from another source, possibly the theoretical Q source, a hypothetical Q source. But Luke does different. Luke doesn't do block. Luke interweaves, like he mixes the teaching and the healings quite a lot more at a faster pace or a faster alteration than what Matthew does. But all of this it really just shows us that we're not dealing with someone writing a diary of where Jesus went. It's the mixing of sources and the editing of sources, the laying out of sources that makes sense to the writer, whether it be Mark, Matthew, or Luke. All right, that's the end for today. Next week, we want to have a look at exorcisms, which is a very important subject, of course, especially in the light of the apocalyptic context of Jesus. Exorcism plays a massive role, but a diminishing role. Give you a little taster. In Mark, exorcism is the thing. In John, there's not one exorcism. It diminishes as time goes on. But anyway, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Cheers.